Hello, everybody. It's Jason, and welcome to the Season 3 finale episode. Hard to believe. This is episode number 58. So episode number 58. If you haven't listened to many of them in the past or didn't even know that there were that many episodes, I hope you will go back to Season 1, Season 2, and certainly throughout Season 3, which we're going to talk about today, and enjoy the different messages and the interviews, the great stuff that has come across our ears during Season 1, 2, and now this finale for Season 3.
Welcome back to the Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you're currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps on your journey. I've never been more convinced. The best leaders and team cultures in the world are the ones that make time to step back and calibrate their thermostat. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now let's dive into today's topic to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world.
Season 3 has been wild. Season 3 has been wild. There's so much that's been happening, of course, in the world. It's been a strange, it's been a scary time, and certainly with the rise of COVID and economic uncertainty and political unrest and civil unrest and social justice issues and our kids being homeschooled or hybrid or online, it has been a strange time. So my hope, as always, is that this podcast has been meeting you where you are, has been a supportive, positive, great thing in your life that has added value and contributed to your day or your moments throughout your weeks. I hope it's been an opportunity for you to engage your mind and heart. And sometimes our brains and our hearts, even in the midst of all of this that we're experiencing, sometimes we just need a rinse and repeat. And as you've heard me say before, we all have an effing problem. We all have an effing problem, and what I mean by that is our effing problem is we forget. We forget. And so the best learning that we experience and that comes to us is when we rinse and repeat what we need to hold in our minds and our hearts, that we return to messages, that we give time for reflection, for marination, time to kind of rinse and repeat and hear the messages again so that they can percolate. That's when our greatest development and learning often happens, when we're able to sit with something and even hear a message for the second, third, or fourth time, which is why you hear me and anybody that I'm involved with a leadership development or culture shaping initiative with their team and organization. You hear me say this so often that we need to rinse and repeat. We can't just say a message one time. We can't just learn something one time and expect it to stick. We need to rinse and repeat the messages. So the purpose of this podcast today, this Season 3 finale, is to let our minds and our hearts wander through some of the paths that we've been on in Season 3. And again, even if you're somebody that hasn't listened to all these episodes yet in Season 3, then I hope it gets you excited and piques your interest and allows you time and space to go back and maybe listen to some of these. And if you are someone that is a religious listener to this podcast and somebody who's a great supporter and that this has been a great place and added value to your day and your weeks, then I hope you'll hear these messages again. Let them be rinsed and repeated and help them allow some time and space for you to think and to reflect on some of these messages. So let's let our minds wander back through the journey we've been on. This podcast, Season 3, has had some powerful quarantine chats. If you remember right, as COVID and quarantine and isolation began, I began to do some interviews and some quick chats, what I called quarantine chats, with many great people, which I'll talk about here in just a second, and then also just extended interviews in Season 3. Fantastic voices that have joined me in conversation about the state of the world and how we navigate our way through this with our own leadership mindset and certainly the culture that we are creating with the people around us. So some of those voices, if you remember, if you allow yourself to wander back through season 3 and through some of these quarantine chats, I'll remind you of those great conversations I've had with people like Kendall Harrell. Kendall, the vice president of people and culture at Caribou Coffee. A really wonderful conversation with my friend Kendall. Ken Boyer, the America's director of inclusiveness recruiting at Ernst & Young. So across North and South America, his position of inclusiveness recruiting across Ernst & Young. Both of those conversations were so powerful, especially at a time with so much social justice and civil unrest taking place. Great chat with Gina Malacone, who's an author, Gina Malacone Long, author and co-founder of Greatness U. Had a great, she lives in Canada, and we were able to link up during COVID and talk about where do we put our focus and how do we begin to make sure that we keep our focus on the present moment and what brings about our best in that moment. An interview with author and founder of Sparkspace, my good friend Mark Henson. A great time when his business was certainly challenged by COVID and going through the ups and downs of a business that has been so successful and brought so much good creative space and energy for teams and organizations. And then all of a sudden COVID hits, and a time when space and getting out of the office and bringing people together isn't happening. And yet him thinking about how do we navigate our way through this was a great and powerful conversation. Howard Behar, the former president of Starbucks, an amazing mentor and advisor and friend of mine, and just a wealth of experience over his years of leading Starbucks, joined me, and every time I chat with Howard, that's always a great time. Carrie Twigg, former White House staffer under the Obama administration and founding partner of Culture House Media. She and I linked up for a great chat when she was in London, England, actually quarantined with COVID, and had a really fascinating conversation with her. Founders Gretchen Dussault and Carrie Croft and their leadership team from System of Strength, the fun and engaging workout studios and digital studio platform for fitness. We had a great conversation with them. Bobby Carpenter, ESPN analyst and former Dallas Cowboys first-round pick and ex-Ohio State football legend, joined me to talk about how in the midst of especially somebody like him that is so regimented and scheduled and learned to do that throughout his athletic career as a professional, these times of quarantine and throwing curveballs and uncertainty, how do we navigate our way through that? And lately, we've had powerful interviews that I've shared on the podcast with people like Jessica Jackley, co-founder of the social enterprise unicorn, Kiva.org. If you don't know much about Kiva.org, I really encourage you to listen to that episode, but talking with Jessica about founding that and then growing that platform for micro lending around the world for people in poverty and other parts of the world. Amazing episode. Leslie Visser, sports broadcasting legend and really a woman pioneer for CBS Sports and beyond. A really engaging conversation with her. Recently, Doug Ullman, CEO of Pelotonia, cancer survivor and advocate that has been a part of the effort to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for cancer research. Kevin Clayton, Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Engagement for the Cleveland Cavaliers and all their operating companies. Kevin and I had a fascinating conversation about racism and civil unrest and the role that we all play as leaders in creating cultures with people that we work with and in our communities and around the world. And then most recently on the podcast, we shared a past interview with Cameron Mitchell, a restaurant guru and somebody that pre-COVID was that voice reminding us that no matter what, serve and keep your people first, and that will help you get through any challenges that come your way. Words that are even more relevant today as we deal with all the challenges that are around us. So it's been an amazing group of people. I mean, as I listen and even go through those names of the people that we've been lucky to share on the podcast, their voices, and to connect about authentic leadership and culture. If you didn't listen to those episodes, I hope you'll go back and rinse and repeat and think about that. There have also been other topics that hopefully have engaged your mind and heart, these MicroPods. I really love the format that we've been doing on this podcast of not only the extended interviews, but the micro podcasts, the shorter, in that 12 to 20, 22 minute range, those podcasts that are these nuggets that are hopefully engaging your mind and heart and helping you reflect and think about your own authentic leadership in the world and the culture that you're trying to create with the people around you. Some topics that we covered in season 3. We talked about the secret to elite performance. And that secret is that rest, that everybody always talks about the 10,000 hours, the 10,000 hour rule that Malcolm Gladwell made famous, research that was done that in order to become elite or world class at something, you needed 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. But the thing that we often don't talk about in terms of that research is it wasn't just the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Really, embedded in the research that nobody talks about is also that what it is necessary to be an elite performer is 12,500 hours of deliberate rest. And so we often talk about how, the best in the world at whatever their craft is or whatever it is that they do, these athletes, these musicians, these artists, these entrepreneurs, these teachers, whoever you think of as the best, oftentimes we talk about the 10,000 hours of working and practicing and grinding in order to become the expert, which absolutely is a part of the process. But we don't talk about the 12,500 hours of deliberate rest, that becoming elite in something is not just about putting your head down and grinding, but it's also about deliberate rest and allowing our minds and hearts to recover and recoup and stay focused on the tasks at hand. We talked about the idea, especially in COVID and the challenges that we've been having, that courage is sitting in ambiguity. Courage is truly being able to sit in times when things are ambiguous, when things are unknown and uncertain. And the best leaders are able to sit in that ambiguity and not stew over it, but then be able to say, what are the next actions? What is within my control? And what am I going to put into practice next? And that oftentimes in the midst of ambiguity and uncertainty, we're forced to innovate. That we're forced, that in the midst of the world changing and different things that are changing all around us, that it's in those moments where we find these opportunities and elements of forced innovation, which means we are forced to innovate, to try something new, to do something new, to think differently about a problem and to solve it in new ways. And that's what the best leaders do in the midst of crisis and challenges. They have courage in ambiguity, and then allow their eyes to see those opportunities for innovation to emerge. We talked about the idea that there is no vaccine for your company culture. Even though so much of this year we're talking about vaccines and when is a vaccine going to be available and when are we going to have this thing that's going to make us all better and or protect us from whatever's to come. And the reality is, I talked about there is no vaccine for your company culture. There is no magic pill. There is no shot in the arm. There's no magic wand to make your culture, your team or your organization, the culture that you desire, the one that you want out in the future. It's not some easy drive-through experience. That in fact, creating culture is about the steady, we talked about the 6A process for leading change, and that all change follows the same pattern. But we have to be intentional. And so, unfortunately, there's no vaccine for your culture, but it does mean that we need to begin the process. And if you want that culture to be created in the future, it's time to get intentional and begin the 6A process for leading change. We talked about the infinite game versus the finite life. I love the language that Simon Sinek brings in his new book, The Infinite Game. But this idea that the game that we're playing, the best leaders, teams, and organizations realize that their mission is longer term, that it's not just about what numbers you hit next quarter or that next sale or what you have to do only in the next moment in order to get success. It's about taking the long view and returning to what is the mission for over time. And then, yes, the reality is we do live a finite life. We do live a finite, our business and our teams, that our experience with them might be finite. And so that means that we need to seize the day and certainly not wait to do something we want to do. But in the same time, we need to seize the day, but also keep the longer view of our relationships and the mission of our organizations. We need to keep that and realize that we're actually playing an infinite game, a game that's going to go on beyond us. And that's the game that we need to continue to remember that we're playing. I told the story of the Golden Buddha, a story that reminds us of the gold that we all have within us. And yet, if you go back and you listen to that story, the reminder of the fact that all of us have this unique strengths and gifts and abilities and beauty that is within every single human being, and yet so oftentimes we hide it or we forget it, and oftentimes we mask it, and yet sometimes we need to return to and be reminded that we all have gold within, and how can we make sure that we're sharing that with the people around us. I talked about the leadership lesson of postponement versus cancellation, and that the best leaders in the midst of all this COVID and the challenges and everything that's been swirling around us, we've seen really good examples of leaders that have taken the approach of, hey, let's not make a rash decision. Let's not make a knee-jerk reaction. Let's allow ourselves time and space to step back and not just make a knee-jerk reaction of canceling something, and realizing that the best leaders actually postpone. Now, there are always times, of course, there are always examples where when it is time to cancel something. But what's played out right in front of our eyes in this past year is that the best leaders have been the ones that realize that they need to give themselves and their teams and their organizations the gift of time. And so postponing, buying yourself time so you can gather data, make more informed decisions, and ultimately then make a decision, those leaders are the ones that have risen to the top in the midst of challenging and uncertain times. So we need to remember that it's okay to postpone. And there's always times, of course, examples of when we need to cancel, but we can't jump to that knee-jerk reaction to just cancel without realizing that we can give ourselves the gift of time. I talked about the difference between competing and focusing on competing versus focusing on the competition. And as we study and research the best leaders, teams, and organizations, the best leaders, teams, and organizations, they understand and they are aware of the competition, but that's not where they spend most of their time. They are not fixated on the competition. They don't spend all their waking hours only worried about the competition. They're aware of them. They understand their tendencies. They understand how they're playing. They understand how they need to compete with them. But instead of fixating on the competition, the best leaders, teams, and organizations spend most of their time focused on what does it mean for them to compete, and practicing and developing how do they become the best of them authentically. How does your team or your organization, how do you develop and learn how to compete at the very best of who you are and what you're doing in the world, rather than just being fixated on the competition? I talked about the 4 statements that every team member needs to hear, that along our development journey that we're on, that every single one of us, not only in our teams and organizations, but in our lives, all of us need to hear these 4 statements from people around us. And oftentimes the role of a mentor, a coach, or just a significant relationship in our lives, we need to hear these 4 things. Those messages of, I'm proud of you, that I'm proud of you, you as you, The things, yes, you've accomplished in the past, but I'm proud of you as a person and who you are right now. I believe in you. I believe in what it is that you are going to do in the future, and that the strengths and the authenticity of you is going to be a value add for the people around you, and I believe in you. Third, we need to make sure that people hear that you're capable of more, that none of us are perfect, and all of us have moments in our relationships, on our teams and organizations. We have moments where we don't bring the very best of ourselves to the table. We have moments where we fall short of really the leader we want to be, or the decision that we make, or we say the wrong thing, or we don't follow through on something that we said we were going to do. And it's in those moments where the statement we need to hear is, you're capable of more. I share on that podcast that some of my greatest learnings in my life were when people that I trust, people that have earned the right to be able to say this to me, that said, Jason, you're capable of more. And that's when some of the best learning emerges. And then lastly, after we say you're capable of more, to make sure that we hear the statement of, I support you. I'm going to walk with you, and I'm going to be with you, and I want to help you and support you so that we can make progress next. Every single one of us as humans, not only teammates and organizations, but as humans, we need to hear those 4 statements. We also talked about culture and the fact that the difference between allowing versus teaching. And I talked about in the culture-shaping world and with teams and organizations that I serve, not only my books and speaking, but the ongoing work that I have, the partners that I have to help develop leaders and culture and clarity around mission, vision, values, that I often talk about what we allow lingers, and what we teach triggers. And so in every team or relationship or group culture, the habits, the behaviors, the tendencies, those things that we just kind of allow are the things that linger. And we always have to, we have to choose our battles. We got to pick our battles, right? So there's some things that in every relationship, every team and organization we allow, but we need to make sure that the things that we're allowing, the bad habits, the bad tendencies, the bad behaviors on our teams or relationships or organizations, that if they're not being addressed, then they kind of linger and they become toxic for the entire culture. But what we teach triggers. And so to ask ourselves, what is it we're teaching? What is it that we are teaching in our relationships and our teams and organizations? Because what we teach oftentimes triggers a chain reaction of events beyond just those teaching. And it sets people up for clearer expectations and a vision for what it is that we want. And so what we allow may linger, but what we teach triggers. And some of the last 2 topics that we talked about in Season 3 is the idea of the term love in business. And I told a great story from my friend Howard Behar from Starbucks about how he was celebrated. And the word love doesn't get thrown around in business very often. And yet he was somebody at Starbucks and throughout his career that showed people that really we need to love people and that it's okay to love our teammates. Now, in the appropriate way, of course. But what would it look like if we truly loved our people? And what would that mean for the decisions we make, for the way we speak to each other, and for the culture that we create? How can we infuse love in very appropriate ways inside of our teams and organizations? And lastly, we talked about in the idea of investing time versus managing time. Where do you invest your mind, invest your heart, your resources, your time, versus where are the places that you're just kind of managing time and you're just kind of doing what comes across your path and oftentimes are not your highest priorities or not the most important things that you need to have your focus on. So the best leaders, teams, and organizations are constantly stepping back to look at where are we not just managing our time, but where are we investing our time? And are we investing our time into our highest priorities, into our highest relationships, and to the projects that need our minds, our hearts, our resources, and our times? So I hope that was a real quick at least rinse and repeat back through some of the topics and some of the great conversations that have happened in Season 3. And again, I hope that this sparks in you a desire to go back and rinse and repeat and listen to those messages again. Or if there were any of those in there that you didn't hear, I hope you'll dive back in and make sure that you go and give those episodes a chance, because it's been a phenomenal Season 3. The last thing that I'm going to do on this podcast today is there are a few questions that have come in across Season 3. I just want to reflect on some questions that have come in from listeners for this season, and some things, I guess, for us to step back and to ponder. So some questions that have come in Season 3, some questions for me that I'll just quickly get through. The first question is, how did the Thermostat Cultures Live event, how did it go this year virtually? And what was that like to pivot from an in-person event to a virtual event? That is a great question, and I appreciate those of you, or whoever that was out there that asked that question. You know, the history of that Thermostat Cultures Live event, this was the fourth year that I've hosted this event of my own, Thermostat Cultures Live. And in the past, it really started out with a desire to just get an amazing, eclectic group of people all in one room. I wanted across industries and just amazing people that are in positions of leadership and are passionate about developing culture. And I just wanted us to get everybody in one space and have a day that we were committed to talking about authentic leadership and creating cultures and setting that temperature throughout our lives and our teams and organizations. And then I've been in the lucky role of hosting this and speaking, but also inviting other voices, people I admire that are in roles that could share their voices in this. And so this year, absolutely, we had to pivot. You know, pivoting has been the name of the game in 2020. And so when COVID and everything that was happening in the world began, you know, first I wasn't sure whether we could even do the event. And so I immediately was just kind of thinking, oh, this isn't the year. Certainly we're not going to be able to gather in one place. But the more I talked about it, and fortunately the more trusted people that I talked to and voices that have been a part of that event in the past, the more that I realized is that now more than ever, that this spirit of authentic leadership and creating culture in the world is needed more than ever. And so we did pivot. We pivoted to an all-virtual format, and with the Remo platform and great partners at Platinum TDM, we hosted an online virtual event in kind of quick fashion and pulling it all together in an amazing way. Over 170 people registered, attendees attended the 3-hour event. There was very high engagement and tremendous feedback about this event. So how did it go? For the first time doing this all virtual event, I've certainly spoken at many, many, many different virtual events, especially over the last few months. But to host my own online in that kind of cool platform, it was a huge success. And really, it made me realize that I can't wait till we can be back in person in the future. Of course, I can't wait to that time because there's such energy of being in the same space with people. But this online and virtual and cool platforms that exist allow us to reach further and engage more minds and hearts. And so I'm excited about the possibilities of what that's going to look like in the future. And I hope you will join in and invite your team and organization to get involved, because it's been a powerful, powerful event. Next question that came in is, I always get this at the end of a season, do I have a favorite pod episode from Season 3? And if so, why? Again, I loved all of the interviews. Man, what powerful people, examples, people that have great synergy with me or my messages, and people that inspire me. Great examples of work that they're doing in their organizations or in their lives. So all of them were really important. I guess one of them or a couple of them that jump out right off the top of my head, recently the interview that I did with Kevin Clayton, the Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Engagement for the Cleveland Cavaliers. Man, what a great conversation. And really, and some of the conversations that we continued into the Thermostat Cultures Live event, that really I was hoping that this would be a model for how do we enter into tough conversations about tough topics like racism and our role as leaders and culture creators in the midst of so much divide that's in the world right now. And so I think it was a great, hopefully a model, and it was an inspiring and engaging conversation about how do we enter into those tricky conversations, but bring our whole selves and really connect with each other. So I needed that conversation and was so glad that my friend Kevin jumped in and led me in that conversation. Doug Ullman, CEO of Pelotonia, that interview was fantastic. I just, every time I get a chance to talk with Doug, he's humble, he's kind, he's real. We had a great conversation about the world that we're in right now and leading, and yet we need to be skeptic. We need to be a skeptic, which means, but there's a real difference between skepticism and cynicism. Being a skeptic is meaning that we are curious, we're asking good questions, and when we ask skeptical questions of, hey, why are we doing this, or what if we did this, we're asking it because we're curious and we actually want to know the answer. And so it's good to ask skeptical questions, but with that spirit of, I want to know and I want to grow and to learn, which is totally different than cynicism. Which cynicism is when we're asking questions where we don't really want the answer. We're asking them in such a way that our goal is to kind of get the other person. We're asking a leading question, a kind of gotcha question. And that right now in the world, so many people are trending towards this kind of cynical dialogue, cynical questioning, rather than being kind of the heart of a skeptic. So I thought that was a really important and good conversation for the world we're in right now. And then, as I've said, I've loved the MicroPod style, and some of my favorite nuggets of those podcasts that have been around, at least ones that come to my head, are the one about culture, what we allow lingers, and what we teach triggers. I think that's been language that's been really helpful for many teams and organizations, and as they think about the process of shaping culture and how important that is to be intentional, and the work that I do with teams and organizations to help them design that intentional culture, I think that language was really important, and certainly I've received great feedback. And then the other one about the 4 statements that we all need to hear. That's an important one. I tell some stories on that pod about when I've received those statements from mentors and people in my life and how impactful that has been. And so the power of our words, the power of connecting with people and reminding them of those important statements, that's another one that kind of jumps out to me. 2 more questions. One, how has the coronavirus impacted your speaking engagements and your business? Yep, that's one that I continue to get almost everywhere I go. People look at me like, hey, are you doing okay? How are things? Like everyone, there have been, anyone out there in the world, there have been delays, there have been postponements, certainly inconveniences, and a lot of ambiguity as to what does the future of the meeting industry and events that bring people together, what does that look like? There's been a lot of ambiguity, but I can report, and I'm very grateful and lucky to report that, I really haven't had one outright cancellation. I haven't had one thing that has been canceled. Really just postponements. And really the pivot has come from a lot of great events, certainly moving virtually and or pushed and postponed until 2021. And really with my longer-term clients, beyond just a keynote speech or a workshop or a leadership team retreat or a board retreat or something like that, my longer-term clients, those companies and organizations that I have a year or longer agreement with, fortunately, we have just pivoted and we've said, hey, let's utilize the technology that we have for remote and virtual technologies to help craft messages to engage minds and hearts and align mindsets around leadership and culture, that we can't become disconnected and scattered and disengaged. And so we're certainly planning for the future for in-person events and still been doing some socially distant, smaller leadership team events to make sure people are aligned and that there's a strategy behind developing leaders and culture. But we know that it's increasingly going to become important to make sure that as leaders and cultures and teams that we get back on track, and we can't stay isolated and disconnected forever. And so If you didn't think developing people and culture was important before 2020 hit, then what I'm experiencing is teams and organizations are realizing that we have to be aligned around leadership and culture, and that will help lead their organizations out of this mess better than those who aren't aligned and don't have a strategy and aren't committed to developing people and culture and communicating and engaging people. That will be 100% true. I'm certain of that. So I'm fortunate that I actually continue to grow my work and opportunities to support teams and organizations, and because developing people and culture has never been more important than it is today. So I appreciate the question, and certainly many people in my life have asked that, and it's ambiguous. There's a lot that's unknown, but I'm certainly I am very grateful and also inspired by the fact that developing leaders and culture is something that is going to continue to be a valuable piece of every successful entity. The last thing I would put out there to you, I know you all have been asking me questions, but I would ask a question of you. I would ask for season 4, what are the topics that you want more of? What are topics that you want to hear me engage around or talk about in season 4? And if there are people that come to your mind, who are people that you would want me to interview or that you would want me to share their voice on this podcast? If you have people like that, I hope you'll send us a message, info at jasonvbarger.com, info at jasonvbarger.com. You can email us the topics that you would like us to cover or potential people that you think would be a great interview, or you can shoot us a message that's just through the form on jasonvbarger.com. So I hope to hear from you. Lastly, I'll just remind you of this as we round out 2020 and then look forward to another exciting, engaging season 4 that's coming in January of 2021. Lastly, I'll just remind you as we enter this holiday season to lastly take care of the people around you. Get creative. I'm saying this to myself as much as I am to you, to get creative even in the midst of things that are canceled or put on hold or paused. How can we get creative to still have fun and make room with the people and the team and the organization we're serving to connect and get clear on the next vision and what are the next actions we're going to put into practice? So enjoy the holiday season. I hope you'll go back and listen to more past episodes, and I hope this has been a great rinse and repeat for you, and I look forward to being back in touch and more engaging content coming with Season 4 in 2021.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast or social media platform you're using. And share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of these conversations. That way, this spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or developing leaders and culture would be helpful to your organization, or you have a question or comment about this podcast, please contact us at jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we all are ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work. We have to own the vision we want to be a part of. The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.